Hello, and welcome to Booked Solid, New Canaan Library's podcast for adventurous readers across all genres. I'm your host, Kathleen, a collections librarian.
I'm your host, James, an adult services librarian.
And I'm your host, Kat, a children's librarian.
And today we are discussing Roman Stories by Jhumpa Lahiri. And this is actually really exciting because this is part of our library's 17th annual literary luncheon. This is the book that we've picked this year. And the Literary Luncheon will be Friday, November 8th at the Country Club of New Canaan. We have been celebrating all month, you may have noticed, with book groups and other things. You may have seen our Vespa next to the reference desk upstairs. So we're really excited about this book, and I can't wait to discuss it with you guys.
So let me just give you a quick introduction about what Roman Stories is about before we start talking about it. So it's a collection of short stories that broadly looks at the lives and experiences of people who are in or around Rome. These people are never named in the stories, and they come from different classes, backgrounds, and all kinds of walks of life.
Since this is a short story collection, we've actually selected 3 of the stories to discuss in great detail. Peas Parties, Well-Lit House, and The Steps. We will be spoiling these in their entirety, and we also won't hesitate to spoil other stories if they come up and enrich our discussion.
All right, everyone. So what did we think about this book?
So I think one of the things we have talked about is that we're not all of us huge short story readers. So this was something that I came into a little nervous about, and I think specifically wondering, how are we going to talk about this? Because, you know, there are so many stories, we can't talk about all of them. Are we going to be able to find enough that we feel we can talk about in a way that is just like our regular book discussions? So I ended up really liking these stories and finding so many things that I wanted to discuss with you guys. And I think as we talked about it more before recording the podcast, we realized there were so many similar themes and things. So in the end, I got really excited about this, and all of that initial trepidation kind of went away.
I agree. There's just so much to talk about in these stories that I think if we had tried to tackle all of them at once, kind of giving it a broad overview or something like that would have been a huge fool's errand. We would have had to really kind of dial it back. And I think that with these 3 stories that we've selected to talk about, I think we can really focus on the elements of this collection that are just so powerfully just depicted and brought to life in these stories. You really do see that Jhumpa Lahiri, she's a master of the form, and this is absolutely just an example of short stories done as well as they could be.
This was the second collection of Lahiri's that I've read. I obviously picked up Interpreter of Maladies first, and that was years and years ago. But I came to this collection anticipating seeing her as a master sort of restraint is a way I would describe it. She doesn't need to say a lot to say a lot. She chooses her words very precisely and intentionally, and it was really exciting to read this collection with a bit more of a history with her work. I also love her book, In Other Words, which is the first book she wrote in Italian. And she discusses learning Italian as a way of finding artistic freedom and of getting to relearn the craft of writing and having to think even more carefully about every word when you're not a native speaker of it. And it's so impressive that she wrote this book in a language she learned as an adult. And I really, really enjoyed it. I am curious, when I read short stories, and I do read usually 1 or 2 collections a year, do you have a preferred way to read them? I was telling people here that I usually read a maximum of 2 stories in a collection a day. I try not to read more than that because I want to give the stories time to be on their own.
I think that's a great point, and it's something that I don't always think about. I think usually, because I haven't read as many short story collections, I think I tend to treat them as novels and just read it straight through. But one thing that I really noticed as I was reading this and preparing to discuss it is that I wanted to sit with the stories more and kind of regretted that I had been reading it straight through. Because when we were thinking about, well, which stories do we want to highlight? Which are the ones that have really left a lasting impact? I did find that the more time that had passed, the more I was able to really appreciate certain stories. And sometimes some of the stories that had been the most memorable and dazzling to me initially became not less dazzling, but certainly ones that kind of took the back seat to stories that I had initially not really thought of as being, maybe they were quieter or something, but they ended up being really lasting. So I think it's interesting to see the kinds of stories that linger, and then you start to appreciate the details the more you have time to sit with them.
Yeah, there are certainly some quieter stories in this collection, that invites you to sit with it, to reread it as soon as you finish it, to kind of linger with the characters and to consider why these people might be feeling this way or why they might have acted in a certain way. Because again, there's so much restraint being shown in these stories that you're getting so little in the terms of how much text is actually on the page and how much time you have to spend in these specific stories, but there's so much happening in there. I did also, like you, Kathleen, I treated the first few stories like kind of more like a novel where I've read it, thought about it for a little bit, and moved on to the next one immediately. And then when I reread it, actually, I reread the collection, and I was much slower and more deliberate with it, and I found that I got so much more out of it by letting myself stay in those spaces and really consider what was happening.
So speaking of thinking about why a character made the choices they did, I think we should dive into our discussion of the first story chronologically that we're discussing today, which is Peas Parties.
All right, yeah, let me give you a quick summary if you haven't read the collection yet or you just haven't read this one yet. So Peas Parties is, and we should clarify here, P is an unnamed character. So P is the initial standing in for this character, so the title of the story is literally the letter P, and then it's Peas Parties. So at a party hosted by the generous P, an unhappy married author fixates on a woman, L, who he has a brief, vulnerable conversation with. At the next one of P's parties, to his chagrin, his wife and L strike up a friendship. He then begins to write a kind of short story wherein he and L have an affair that took place after their first conversation rather than her befriending his wife. This fantasy that he creates for himself ends up affecting him enough that he winds up kissing L in front of his wife and P and other people and ruins their vacation.
This story, I want to say, is this the second or third one in the collection?
Third?
I believe it's the third.
It's the third in the collection. And the first two are, I would say, a bit more emotionally heavy in terms of their content. So coming to Peas Parties, which is a story I would say that is sort of about connection and miscommunication and alienation in a more lighthearted sort of sense most of the time, was kind of like a moment to breathe overall in the collection. And I really enjoyed P herself as a character, like rereading her about her parties. It sort of felt to me, because Peas Parties are a place where many people who are native to Rome, as well as many foreigners who are there in Rome briefly or staying more long-term, mingle. It's sort of a microcosm of the collection and also of the city itself. It's a place where a lot of people who don't know each other very well get a chance to interact. It sort of becomes a microcosm of the city, which is really unique.
Yeah. And I think one of the wonderful things that this story does is it is both a pretty funny story about a person who is, I don't know if I would say overinflating their own importance in the story, but their perspective of what's going on is so skewed by this specific, very meaningful interaction to them that a lot of elements that I would consider to be like core pieces of this story kind of are set by the wayside. Pete throws these big parties every year because she almost died, and this is kind of a celebration of life and the joy of living that she wants to share with so many people, and she makes them all happy, and it's this really moving, great thing that she's doing. And this guy is just fixated on this one encounter he has, and in the background, P is doing all of these things, and it's wonderful, and there's sorrow, there's real tragedy at the end of this. P relapses whatever sickness she had, and she does die at the end of this. And he pulls back, and he's like, wow, this is a really sad thing, and it's really not about me. And at the very end, he kind of makes it about him again, and it's just so funny. I don't know.
It's really funny. I think the moment I realized our main character had I think it's very human, right? We can rag on this character, and I absolutely am about to. But it's very human to have an interaction with someone that you interpret one way and the other person interprets totally differently. So just to set the scene for when he meets Elle, the woman at this party, she is distraught because all of the kids at the party are playing outside, and they hear that the kids have gone quiet, and when they run out, Elle's son has stopped breathing. We don't know why. He ends up being okay, but Elle is very upset at the fact that she basically almost watched her son die. And they have this conversation about I almost saw the worst thing that could ever happen today. And it's very interesting that the main character sees this man sees this woman in this position of vulnerability and thinks, wow, this is what being in love is like. Right? Or this is what connection is, but he has not revealed any similar vulnerability.
Right.
Yeah, I think connection is the key word here, because at first I don't think he even sees
No.
it as romantic.
No.
This is, I think, one of the other things that I just love about the story. On the second read, I caught this too. I thought, this is a person who, he's a writer. So he is looking for these moments of connection in his day-to-day life. He knows that, these kinds of things are interesting to people. And when it happens to him organically, there are moments in our lives where there's just like heightened emotions, heightened awareness, and they feel so special and important to us. But he turns it into something else because he just keeps coming back to it and just misinterpreting it and reinterpreting it. He just makes a disaster of the whole thing.
Yeah, I think the point that you make about rereading it is a great one, because I think rereading it was a different experience for me, because I think there is a little bit of a learning curve of like how weird this guy is. I don't know how much I'm approaching it that way when I'm first reading it, from the beginning, like, okay, I'm along for the ride. And then all of a sudden this happens and I'm like, okay, this guy, he's kind of getting deep into his delusions. But the second time reading it, you can see all of those details and all of those things. And I think it's really interesting. So kind of the context of the parties that P has, they happen with two distinct groups kind of mingling. So the main character is talking about how he'll see the people who have lived in Rome forever. He and his wife were born and raised in the city, and she has known P since she was a child. And then there are all of the people who, the quote is something like they've come for work, love, or a change of scenery. And these are people who may live there for a few years. You may see them at some parties, but they're not really a fixture. And so he views them as future stories,
Yeah.
which I don't even know that I picked up on that the first time, but it's certainly troubling the second time around. And very telling.
It's sort of like he sees this woman and then she talks to him about her unhappiness and her marriage, right? They have this very vulnerable conversation, or at least she's very vulnerable in it. And it's like for him, a character that he would write has walked up to him and knows his name. It's so interesting. When he goes to the next party, he worries about what he's wearing, and he takes a wrong turn because he's so nervous. And he says that he senses that they share a special link.
Oh, yeah.
And she, I don't think, remembers the conversation this way at all.
No, not
She
at
finds him
all.
annoying because he just keeps staring at her.
She will not. She keeps looking away, like, please walk away. And you, as the reader, are just like, please walk away. But he's not walking away. And he's reading all of these things into her gaze that aren't even there. He's envisioning all of this stuff that's all in his head. And it's so cringeworthy.
And this he hasn't even, this isn't even the romantic part. He doesn't even inject the romantic element into this at all. He's just thinking of it as like a heightened emotional moment, or like a moment of like special importance.
I also noticed one thing the second time around. I mean, this is the thing, is the details are really precise, and they really do, they reward a second reading, but they almost require a second reading, I think, because there were all of these things that I just thought were so interesting. And I don't know if we've really spoken about this yet, but one thing that Lahiri is doing in this collection is she is using unnamed characters. So, I mean, James, you talked about P being just the initial P. None of the characters in these stories really have names. They just have descriptors, different ways that you can tell them apart. And in this one, the way that this man is thinking of this woman when he sees her again is the distraught woman.
Ooh.
Which, yeah, I mean, I think initially I was like, well, she has to describe this woman somehow, and now we understand as the reader. And this time I'm like, oh my goodness, why are you doing this?
It's also worth noting that he remembers Elle with her initial, but we never get an initial for his wife.
Yes. Good point.
He doesn't seem to like his wife all that much.
No.
He seems like someone who is very unhappy and who has not, I mean, he discusses at the start of the story how, like, for him and people like him who grew up in Rome, the thought of even changing the grocery store you go to is unbearable. And this is someone who's very unhappy and is unwilling to do anything to change it.
And at the same time, on my reread of this, I thought about that and I was like, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
If you live in a place long enough and you make deep connections to your home, your city, your town, little changes like that can feel huge to you. They're just huge. And I'm like, you're not wrong, but man, you're taking this in the wrong way, man. Oh.
I think that's the thing is, I will say, I think we all do feel some degree of sympathy. We understand where he's coming from, but he needed to step away from this before it escalated, because it escalates.
And to be fair, he does say at the end, that this whole thing is trite. He's like, this would not have been a good story, actually. This relationship would not have been good to write about.
There's a moment of self-reflection,
Yes.
certainly.
Mm-hmm.
The escalation when they go out to the ocean, and like his jealousy and annoyance at his wife and Elle becoming friends, like you can feel the tension ratcheting up. The story's about 40 pages long, I think. And the escalation of tension, because despite the fact that this story is quite quiet, I was feeling so nervous about where the story was going.
I didn't see it going anywhere good for this man.
You know, it feels strange in a way to call this funny and laugh at this man's misfortune, but there is certainly something very funny because you can see it like just a slow motion accident, a horrible thing that you know cannot be prevented, but that moment when he's just caught up in his own world, he's just very solipsistic, he's writing this story and it's bled into his psyche, into his real life, and he goes for the kiss, and everyone, I like that it's not just P and his wife, but also all of P's children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awful,
Just
but
a disaster.
very funny because it's so cringeworthy.
He says that his wife refused to calm down and transformed his creative sanctuary into a hell, and my good man,
You have done this to
you have
yourself.
done this,
Absolutely.
unfortunately, to yourself.
So then I just wanted to briefly mention how the story ends, which we've alluded to, which is, in fact, that P does die from, I guess, her previous affliction recurs, and then the last P party is technically her funeral. And so the group is gathered again, and Elle is not there. And one of the things that I found interesting is just the way that I think it's her birthday that she has these parties for. And her birthday parties are kind of like a gathering of all of these different types of people together. And the funeral, they specifically mention it's not really a surprise that Elle wouldn't be there because this becomes more exclusive to like the native Romans who have known P her whole life instead of these kind of like peripheral people. And I just thought that was very interesting to see that contrast. So I think all of these stories, you know, they kind of talk about the way you have these communities, insider, outsider, the native Romans, the immigrants, and there are ways in which they cross paths, and then there are times when they really don't cross paths.
It's interesting too. Most of the stories, if not all of them, I think, in this book, when they refer to people who are not native Romans, the book doesn't really distinguish with different terminology. It won't say immigrant or tourist or foreigner. Usually they just defaults to foreigner. Foreigner is kind of a catch-all term. Mm-hmm. And that does carry on through multiple stories.
Yeah, in interviews, Lahiri has talked about the collection sort of collapsing the binary between native and foreigner. And that's something P did while she was alive, and it doesn't seem like many people in her inner circle perhaps cared about inviting those people to her funeral. That's one way you could read it. I think there's a few different ways you can interpret it.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny because I reread it this time, and it felt like so much more of a celebration of P, even though she's herself kind of a peripheral character. But you really do see, I think, the ways in which she was bringing people together and the ways in which that doesn't happen after she dies. You know, I kind of wish I could see more of her, but of course I think that's the point of the story, is it's all of this man caught up in himself.
All right, well, I think it's probably time to move on to the next story we'll be talking about, which is Well-Lit House. This is a story about a young immigrant and his family who moved to a new tiny apartment somewhere in Rome, and they fill it with love and warmth. They're excited about their future and the promise of just the place they found themselves in. Unfortunately, they become the targets of violent xenophobic and Islamophobic harassment, and eventually the mother takes the children and returns to their home country, promising to return, whereas the father is left homeless and destitute. He goes through a couple mental crises, it seems like, and the story ends, it's implied that he dies by suicide.
So obviously this is a much heavier story than the previous one. And again, I think Lahiri is really, really good at balancing stories that are going to be a little bit lighter with stories that are going to hit a little heavier. One of the things that I found really interesting about this story was the choice of ambiguity in regards to where this family is from. We don't get any of their names, as is true for the rest of the collection as well, which I think in this case was a really smart choice. Mm-hmm. Because I think whatever group she would have picked, every reader would come to those names or to that country's name and would have made assumptions about those people and what they experience based solely on that, regardless of intention. I think we all just carry that knowledge with us. And I think the ambiguity here serves a very specific function of letting us be fully open-hearted to the devastation of the story, which is short and absolutely a gut punch.
And I think it hurts so much more because the start of this story is so full of hope and promise that the connectivity, the connective threads between stories really does shine here as well. The idea of like belonging and creating like a warm space full of love and like a home from like P's parties, the kind of thing that P was trying to do. This family is trying to do it, and they think they're going to make it here, and they're so happy to be here. They're so grateful to be here, and they're working hard to kind of make a life here. And as the story goes on, because of people who don't accept them, it all falls apart for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's really brutal, the irony of they are approaching this house at the beginning as a real refuge. They've gone through so much just to find a place of their own, a place to live. And so this really seems like their fortune is changing, and this really seems like the best possible thing for their family. So to see that reversal and see that this is actually the start of their downfall, it's a really brutal story. I mean, it's really well written and obviously very lasting. I mean, this is one of the ones that really stuck with me after I finished it. But there's really no room for light. I think, despite the well-lit house. I mean, it's just a story that gets darker and darker. I noticed a lot of things on my reread too. So again, I think to just speak to the value of rereading it, one of the things that I thought was so interesting that I don't know that I noticed with any specificity the first time is when they're in the house and they start to notice the world around them. And this is before they really are getting abuse from their neighbors or people around them in town, but they are watching a woman. I think she's across the way or somewhere. She has a balcony and they don't, but she has this balcony. There's like a table and some chairs on it that she never uses. But who does use it is like a family of pigeons. They build a nest there every day, and every night they watch this woman sweep away the nest on the balcony. And I think I at first just saw it as like a little detail, but it's so indicative of the mindset of the people who end up chasing them away out of this house in the story. The fact that although they are not using something, they do not need something, they should have a home where they've been placed, like the pigeons building their nest, but they would rather just sweep that away and destroy it than let anyone have anything.
There's a lot, I think, of really powerful imagery too in this specific story. Light is a big kind of component of the kind of visual things that are happening in this story. The sky is huge, the sky being a place of light and being boundless and infinite. There's possibility there that's mentioned many times. And as the story goes on, the sky is intruded upon by things like clouds, storms. Eventually, at the last moment that the perspective character is looking at it, is he's sitting homeless, like at his lowest point, looking up through the trees, and it says that it's like looking up through the branches at the sky there. It's like the jagged edges of the sky being torn into pieces, comparing, and like he closes his eyes in that moment and it's dark, there's no light, it's moving constantly, as opposed to in the start of the book where he was sitting in the house with his family and he closed his eyes and there was a nice breeze and it felt like the beach, and there was like the light you get at the beach, only at the beach, where you close your eyes and it's warm and there's like this red kind of phosphorescence behind your eyelids. Just the comparison between it is just, it's a gorgeous and really kind of heartbreaking comparison.
It's really consistent imagery as well. Like I just am noticing all of this and appreciating it so much. And like with the pigeons, it's interesting because he often describes in particular the women who are harassing them as raven-haired, as like the raven women, and the way that ravens will harass other birds. Yeah. I am in awe of the story and of like the emotional response. This is one of those ones where I closed the book and I set it down for a couple of days before I came back because I just wanted to stay with the story. I think another of the moments that I think really build to the tragedy is the fact that they moved to this house because his wife is a pretty anxious person, and she was very anxious about where they were living. She was anxious about tree limbs falling on. She saw a tree limb fall on a car and crush it, and she like stayed inside the home with their children for a few days. And after they move, she feels safe and comfortable enough to take her children onto the street again, at least for a brief time. I think another part of the story that I really want to touch on is the reporter.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This reporter originally comes to the family and says, I want to report on what's happening. Can you come and sit with an interview? And so they do this interview. He pours out his story to this reporter. And then the day that it's supposed to drop in the newspaper, something more important happens, is kind of how the book sort of brushes it off. And the reporter who once cared about the story is no longer going to turn heads in the same way because a bigger piece of breaking news has come up. So they're shunted to the side. Their story suddenly no longer matters to any institution. Mm-hmm. Which I think, tragically, the way of news cycles often is that a situation where people are suffering, it may disappear from the news cycle, but that doesn't mean it has disappeared from reality.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and very devastating, because I think you want to have the optimism, the enthusiasm of the main character who's thinking this is going to be our break, our big break in getting, these people to stop bothering us, the harassment, something will happen. But just the idea that I don't doubt that the reporter feels sympathy for them. I don't doubt that there are people who believe that what the Raven women are doing is wrong. But I do think that, they get caught up in their own lives. They get caught up in the news cycle, what they need. And if it's not convenient for them, if it's not something they're thinking about, I think justice is slow, and it can't always help the people who need it when they need it. And then you just see what happens to the people who aren't being helped, who get neglected to the point that their lives fall apart.
Yeah, this is a story that starts out with basically the line saying like, "Oh, well-lit house can change your life," mm-hmm. and it gets to the point where the point of view character is he's trying to get a drink somewhere, and he's talking to a man who is revealed as kind of xenophobic and would be against him if he knew that this man was from a different culture.
Yeah.
And he says, thinking about this, he says, I realized that my whole life I'd felt like an intruder or someone passing through. I'd never found a place of my own. Now my family too was gone, and what had I done? Yeah. And it's just how it goes from that promising start to these depths it's done so powerfully. It's so well done.
I think let's turn our attention now from Well-Lit House, which is a much shorter story, to the longest story in the collection, The Steps. So The Steps is the longest story in the collection, and it's a series of vignettes focusing on 6 different characters who are climbing up or down, sometimes both in the story, a set of famous stairs in Rome. The 6 characters are as follows: an immigrant mother thinking of her son back home as she goes to and from work, an older widow who is fearful of the way the world is changing and of young people who sit on the stairs but blind to real danger, an expat jogging to distract herself from an upcoming medical procedure, a teenage girl dreaming of being a part of mainstream Italian youth culture while on her way home from school to her very strict parents, 2 brothers who are remembering the year they spent in Rome as children, and finally, a screenwriter who is working on a script based on a historical event that happened on the very same set of stairs. This story is so cool because it's essentially, here is Jhumpa Lahiri showing her mastering of the form of short stories 6 times in 40 pages.
Yes, there is a reason why people say, go to a place and look at people and, try and think of stories for them, like it's a writing exercise. And the reason why is because stories like this exist, because you read them and you stop and you kind of wander around stunned for the rest of the day, which is what I did when I read this. I couldn't believe how much character, how much just story and background and just powerful emotions are conveyed in these very short vignettes about people in a similar place. I was completely blown away by this.
Now, I will say, we just learned from P's parties that you shouldn't necessarily walk around and make up stories about people.
No. Yes.
Because that may lead to ruining a vacation. Mm-hmm. But in this case, I think it worked beautifully. Did anyone have a favorite vignette?
So I would say that my favorite, and maybe this is just because I'm really looking for anything a little bit lighter in this collection, because a lot of heavy things happen, a lot of darkness. I did enjoy the 2 brothers vignette. That was my favorite one. I think, and this is not without its sad elements. I think we mentioned that even in the lighter stories, someone dies, usually. But in this one, there are these 2 brothers. Initially, we don't know why they're on the steps. I think that is revealed a little bit later in the story. So they're in their 50s, and they're looking back on when they were like 8 and 10 years old. and their parents were still married at this point, but this is kind of the part where their marriage is falling apart, and then they get divorced not long after. And a large part of the story is just a description of their father falling in love with another father in the city, F. And it actually sounds really lovely. Like, they build this beautiful house, they have this pool. So things work out really nicely for them, maybe less so for the mother. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of a nice story to see that, and an interesting story to see the brothers' perspective on it and what they remember about that time, which I think was very consequential, but in a way that they didn't understand at their ages and at that moment before they really saw their lives change. And we do find out at the end that the reason they are actually on the steps is because their father has died. They're there for the funeral, and they're walking around the steps thinking about the time that they were living in that area when they were 8 and 10. And that's actually where the father and F met.
I also loved this one. I know that it could be seen as a downer when the brothers are like, when the brothers describe how their dad says he saw his future partner and knew that the rest of his life would be different. And you could read that as like, wow, the brothers have never experienced such love. But I read it as like, of them being admiring of their father's courage. And I found that so moving. That was one of my favorites. I think similarly, I also loved one that had a little bit more lightness to it. I loved the first one, The Mother. That was my absolute favorite, mostly because of how it ends. So she's thinking about her son going to and from work. It's extremely mundane. She goes to the butcher. She goes, like, with the children various places. But at the end of the story, I think she had, like, dropped something on the stairs, and one of the miscreant youths who appear throughout this story turns around and is like, oh, you dropped this, miss. And she's like this moment of her feeling at home in Rome, despite the fact that her own son is so far away. Like, she's been accepted into this place in a way that we often don't get in the rest of the collection. So that was my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked both of those stories, but I also liked, kind of surprising for me, because first when I read it, I thought that of all of them, this was the one that I was the least excited about, was the expat. The expat wife. She is a little bit different than all of the other ones because she is feeling disconnected from the city and from this place in a lot of ways. And that disconnection is actually one of the sources of her greatest anxiety that you kind of find out in the short time you're with her. She is worried about, she has an operation, I think, the following day, and she's terrified because they're going to put her under anesthesia. And in the story, she's asking her friends, like, what does it feel like to be under anesthesia? And the friend says, oh, it's nothing. It's over. And the expat is worried because she is afraid of that loss of control. Mm-hmm. She's terrified of becoming, I think in her words, becoming a body that's like fully vulnerable in that sense, because she's moved with her husband to Rome, and he's off like doing work elsewhere for most of the time. So she's here struggling as a woman who is not a native language speaker, so she's struggling to speak the language sometimes. Her children are speaking it better than her, making fun of her for it a little bit, playing around with it. But it's just like a really interesting kind of story where the disconnection from the city, which is so lovingly and viscerally rendered throughout the rest of the stories in this collection. You feel that space, you feel it, you see it soaring before you, and to have someone in there who's kind of disconnected from it is a great counterpoint.
She wishes she was at home. She wishes she was back home where she could have the operation, which I completely sympathize with. If you're going to be in a place that vulnerable, literally on the operating table, it makes sense that you would long for somewhere else, especially if you're not feeling fully comfortable where you are. Yeah, that one really stuck with me. I think because of that section of dialogue where they describe it, and she ends up describing her like childhood home, I think, when her friend, or maybe the home that she gave birth to her children in.
Yeah, I think it's where she says, when you go under, think of the place that like gives you the most comfort.
Yeah, it says she tries to see the roses in the garden of the house they sold before they moved to Rome, presumably. Yeah, that's a really good one.
One thing I noticed about the steps, and actually that made me think of it too, which is interesting. There are all these little details that they resonate in different ways later on. But when you were talking about that, I started to think a little bit about a well-lit house and the idea that the main character is closing his eyes and trying to picture the house, kind of similarly to what she's doing. And one thing that I've noticed, I think maybe in the steps in particular, is that there seem to be all of these variations on characters, things that recur from other stories that appear in different ways, and there's not like a direct line or something, and there are some other stories in the collection I think that do it as well, and they're just similar enough to resemble each other in some small detail, but they're like different ways that something could go, and I find that really fascinating. So I was just thinking about, in addition to that one, which really just struck me right now, the idea with the expat wife that she has this medical issue, and I think it's mentioned that she has 3 sons, and it just seemed like very similar personal details to Pete, even though they are so different in the way that one is from the city, one is not. They're not the same person at all, but it's just interesting to see the recurring things. I noticed that there were a lot of families with like 1 son, and the way that they're thinking about that. So there is this family who loses their 12-year-old son in the procession, for example. And then that made me think of Elle, who almost loses her 12-year-old son in Pete's parties. Just the similarities, the way they kind of resemble each other, but also diverge in the ways that these lives go. I think it's just very interesting to see a recurring kind of theme or detail, but play out so differently.
This is going to sound extremely corny, but I do feel like that is in some ways true to life when you meet someone and they remind you of so-and-so or so-and-so, and like figures that reoccur in your own life who may exist under similar circumstances but have one connecting detail. And that's one of the things I think I love the most about the Steps is so often they're extremely mundane stories.
Yes.
That are so imbued with life and meaning because of how richly the characters are drawn.
I mean, the book, the short stories, they present Rome, this city. It's massive. That all these things are kind of happening. I don't know if they're happening at the same time in the story. It doesn't need to state it out loud. It doesn't need to state it in the text that this is occurring. I can fully believe that all of these are happening at around the same time. It's a big city. There's so much happening. There's so many people there. They're all from all walks of life, from all classes, and they're all just living and experiencing life in this place. And there are those little connective details that kind of allow me to do that in the back of my head. I didn't even have to question it. I was like, oh yeah.
I think that's a good point, though, that I don't know that there is ever any indication, but I kind of like to imagine with the Steps like this is a week or something, and there are just all these different things going on, or a day or something.
It seems like it's a day because they
could
say
be a
the
day.
time at the start of every story.
Oh, okay, yeah. And it's so funny to start with, I think it's the first story and then the last story are kind of bookends with one woman being helped on the steps,
yes,
and then a man being robbed.
We need to talk about the youth. We need to talk about the teens.
We need to talk about the youth.
The teens are okay.
The teens are okay. They are drinking and having a good time on the steps.
They are.
People feel very differently about them depending on who they are. The screenwriter is so interesting because he's like, what if I do a screenplay about the real lives of teens? And he like walks by it in the late at night.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, it's really quiet. I should go up the stairs. And that's when he gets mugged by the teens. It's really funny to get to that scene because earlier in the story, we have the widow who's very scared of the teens, but ends up being tricked by people dressed as police officers. And so we're like, oh, the teens aren't that bad. And then you get to the last story and it's like, well,
kind of.
Some of them might be doing crime.
Yeah.
Some of them.
Yeah, well, it's funny. The screenwriter imagines maybe like a documentary on the teens, and it does almost feel like the story is like if you set up a camera on the teens during the course of a day on the steps, and you just see all of this stuff play out.
Which is basically what happened in this short story.
Yes.
We set up a camera on the steps, and we just kind of follow people around.
Yes, it is the literary equivalent of that.
Should we talk about any other highlights we had from the rest of Roman stories, since we're not going to be talking about the stories in great detail? Any stories that you really liked or really loved that you want to discuss?
Yeah, I just briefly, I'd like to call out the first story in the collection, The Boundary, which is just a really fantastic story about some people who are basically caretakers for a house that they're renting out, and the people who come and the tourists who are visiting, and just kind of the interactions they have between each other, and then the background of why these people are like the caretakers of this house in the first place. Just really moving, and just a fascinating exchange of views and what it's kind of like to observe and be observed, and maybe how you don't recognize that it's happening.
Yeah.
Not even picking out, I think, a particular story, but one thing that I really took from this collection was just a lot of really precise detail work. And sometimes I think that I would forget parts of a story and then just like an image would linger. And I think the one that this is probably the strongest for me is in the Reentry, which I think is kind of a quieter story. It's only the second one in the collection, but the idea of these two women, one who grew up in the neighborhood at the trattoria where they go, and the other woman who, I don't remember where she's from, but she's not from Rome, and she's treated in sort of subtle ways initially, treated differently from the woman that she's having lunch with. But the idea of the child, I think, of one of the owners who just kind of puts her legs out in the middle of a hallway. I think she goes to the bathroom or something. She just puts her legs out and won't let this woman pass. And that visual for me stuck with me for so long. I mean, it's so upsetting, even though it is so mundane. And even more so than some of these like larger, like flashier things, I just kept thinking about that.
It's really disturbing, and it's in its detail. Similarly, speaking of like details that stuck with us, the last story in the collection, Dante Alighieri, is one of my favorites. It's long and kind of existential, and the main character, as a child, would lift up rocks in the woods and look at all of the tiny creatures crawling about underneath and kind of imagine herself as one of these creatures, sort of unobserved until the moment she feels herself being observed. And that's one of the details that really stayed with me.
Yeah, there's some incredible turns of phrase, some incredible just evocative writing across all of these stories that really does stand out.
So I think we had a quote we wanted to discuss from the steps. Kat?
Yes, this is from the screenwriters section, which we didn't discuss in too much detail, but I reselected this quote for its sort of being emblematic of the quality of Lahiri's prose. He'll think with a certain melancholy when he watches the water clamber up the shore that every effort and every pleasure in life, every goal that's reached and achieved, every recollection lasts only for an instant, just like the water that throws itself onto the beach, leaving a spontaneous imprint whose wavering contours, like the line drawn by a heart monitor, are never quite the same. This is actually the screenwriter sort of fantasizing about joining his second wife and children at their beach vacation and surprising her, and reflecting on the fleeting nature of life and also of memory, which is another theme we didn't discuss too much in this collection, but I find recurs.
There's a great, the screenwriter's story too, there's so many great visual elements of his stories, particular with him. There's another part where he's thinking about how when he was with his younger children, how he would catch wasps in glasses for them, and he was their big hero. And he goes to try and catch a wasp in the current day, and he messes it up.
Yeah.
It's just like there's great little visual, like little moments that happen, and they just are really highlighted here.
My final question for either of you, since I think I'm the one who has read more short stories collections generally, does this inspire you to pick up more short stories in the future?
Yeah, I think part of my hesitation with short stories is just that they're not as familiar to me. I read so many more novels than short stories, and this has really, I think, in a pleasant way, has forced me to think about my relationship to short stories, how I approach them. And the idea, I think, that you could have a short story collection and, only read a story or two a week and just let them sit with you and really ponder over these things. I think it's obviously a similar medium to novels, but it is different in ways that I think need to be honored and reflected on. And I do think this has opened me up to it a lot more and made me realize that it's not so intimidating. And it's just a matter of approach.
I think that I'm probably much more receptive to short stories now as well. I do think, somewhat to what you're saying, that learning how to read short stories in a way that allows them to sit with me is very important. And this specific collection definitely showed me that you can get so much out of not just reading a short story and then sitting with it, but revisiting a short story after sitting with it.
Mm-hmm. So we do have some read-alikes that we would recommend. First, and obviously, Jhumpa Lahiri has a lot of other short story collections. Interpreter of Maladies, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Unaccustomed Earth is another collection she wrote. I do have 3 other short story collections that I really love. The first is How to Breathe Underwater by Julie Oranger. This is a bit of an older collection from 2003. They're similarly sort of quiet and restrained, and they focus mostly on kids coming of age and sort of coming of age, coming into an area where they're no longer supervised as closely by adults. One of the stories that really stuck with me is called Note to a Sixth Grade Self, which is a girl writing a note to herself kind of from the future, and that is the format in which the story is told. Another collection that's I really, really love is Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. He primarily writes speculative fiction, but I drew this as a read-alike because similar to Lahiri, he's very precise. He's actually a technical writer by trade, so when he comes to fiction, he's able to paint pictures of things very abstract and conceptual and turn them into something very literal in your mind. The collection Stories of Your Life is pretty well known now because the titular story of Your Life, was adapted into the science fiction movie Arrival and is one of, I think, the best short stories I've ever read. And finally, I want to recommend The People in the Castle and Other Selected Strange Stories by Joan Aiken. Aiken was best well known for her books for children, such as The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, and The People in the Castle is more for people who want the feeling of reading kind of like a storybook. One of my favorite stories in that collection is called Humble Puppy, which is about a woman who inherits a ghost puppy that is keeping her company in her old age.
Adorable.
Yes, it's very good.
All right, I have some read-alikes as well. I was actually really nervous thinking about this because I thought, I never read short story collections. I have nothing to recommend. But I did actually read a short story collection earlier in the year. So Late in the Day, Stories of Women and Men by Claire Keegan, because Claire Keegan is the best. So she's known for Small Things Like These and Foster, which are pretty short novella length stories. But these are short stories. They're reminiscent, I think, of Roman stories in the sense that they are also very quiet literary stories and they are just meticulously observed. So I think if you love the detail work of Roman stories, that's what you'll find here. I think that Keegan is able to just pick up on something that it feels deceptively like a simple scene or a simple concept, and then she just really expands it to something profound. So these can be dark and pessimistic, much like Roman stories as well. They're about complicated gender dynamics. They are thought-provoking, challenging, and even troubling stories. But I thought that it was a really fascinating collection. It's only 3 stories, so a pretty short read, and they're all certainly well worth your time. Last, I wanted to recommend Clash of Civilizations Over an Elevator in Piazza Vittorio by Amara Lackhouse, which reminded me a ton of Roman stories, actually. I was really excited to find this. It's a mystery story. I was really excited to find it because I'd never heard it before, and I was kind of just looking for read-alikes that might work for Roman stories and picked it up on a bit of a whim. But it's a fascinating story about this multiplicity of voices in Rome. So there are these immigrant tenants in a building in Rome, and there are all of these accounts that they're giving. They're giving evidence because there's been a murder in the building's elevator. So it almost feels a bit like a short story collection in that each chapter is kind of the testimony of one of the characters. So it goes from character to character, and they're all describing this one character who has disappeared and is the prime murder suspect. And you have, just like with Roman stories, you have the people who are, it's probably most analogous to the steppes, I would say, because you have the people who are new to the city, and then you have the people who are kind of xenophobic, kind of scared of the way in which the city is changing. They have different feelings about the person who was murdered. They have just a lot of themselves that they reveal as they are giving their testimony. It's also very funny. I mean, it's very satirical. So I think it was just a great read to get a sense of what is this world like that Roman stories is describing. It gave me, I think, a richer understanding of that because I was like, I can kind of see the themes developing across both of these. And it's just a good time. I mean, it's also a mystery story and it's also a satire. So I'd highly recommend it.
If you enjoyed this episode, you will probably really enjoy our next episode, which will be dropping on the last Friday of November. That is the 29th. So something for you to listen to while stuck in traffic, perhaps over the holidays, or hopefully not stuck in traffic. And we will be reading Piranesi by Susanna Clark.
Piranesi is about a home that is more of like a labyrinth. It's a labyrinth because it has infinite rooms, endless corridors, and thousands of statues, each one different from the next. Within this endless kind of maze, there is a person called Piranesi, and they explore the house and have come to an understanding of the pattern and flow of the environment in this very strange place. However, somebody enters the house who calls themselves the other, and they need Piranesi's help to research this place, and they might have more sinister designs for it.
This is a book I think we've all read before, so I think our discussion is going to be lively and engaging. This is our fantasy pick for the season.
Yes, I'm very excited to reread this one.
I'm really excited to discuss this one, and I just want to give a warning to anyone who is tackling it for the first time. It's totally cool to be confused for like the first half, but that's the fun.
Mm-hmm. This is a gateway fantasy book, and just like any good fantasy book, the author doesn't really hold your hand. She sort of expects that you're willing to be a little bit confused for the first part.
Yes, I feel like that's correct.
Yeah. So thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.